most commonly sort of proposed ways to improve productivity of African farming systems is through something called conservation agriculture. The aim of conservation agriculture is to do a couple of things. First, reduce erosion, which then helps to increase the water content of the soil and also increase the soil quality. And then, secondly, to increase soil fertility. And through both of those processes, increase crop yields. There are three sort of facets to conservation agriculture. The first is minimum or no tillage. And the idea here is that by reducing the amount of ploughing that you do on the soil, you reduce the damage to the soil, you don't break up the soil as much, and that makes it much less prone to erosion. And also you retain the plant content in the soil, the organic content, that helps improve the soil structure and water holding capacity. The second sort of arm of conservation agriculture is around retaining permanent soil cover. So rather than leaving the soil bare when you in between your cropping seasons, you leave a residue, a plant residue or mulch on the soil. And that does a number of different things. First of all, it helps to keep the soil cooler and reduce evaporation from the soil. It protects the soil from heavy rainfall events that can lead to erosion. And it also slows down the flow of water over the land when it does rain, and therefore allows the rainfall to infiltrate into the soil and increase soil moisture for farming in the farming season. And then the third arm of conservation agriculture is around crop rotations, or what's called intercropping. So either having different crops in succession on a field, or planting rows of different crops together. That's the intercropping side of it. And the whole idea here is that you should be rotating with what are called nitrogen fixing plants. So every second or third season, you should be planting crops that are very good at fixing nitrogen in the soil and therefore building up the soil fertility. Examples of those include, in an African context, having acacia trees. Acacia trees themselves are very good nitrogen fixers. So if you plant trees in and around your fields, you can really improve soil fertility, and you also can shade some of your crops, which also then reduces heat stress. And then the other is by just planting what are called legumes. So these are peas and beans, lentils. Those are good potential food crops in their own right, but they also are very good at fixing nitrogen in the soil and increasing the fertility of the soil. So if we look at the effects of conservation agriculture around the world, there's quite a range of results, but on average it looks like adopting these techniques can increase your crop yields by between 10 and 30%, depending on the specific local context. So it seems to work slightly better when in more humid conditions, whereas it has an effect, but it's less strong in semi-arid conditions. People have looked at the potential of conservation agriculture in Africa as well, and actually looked at some of the pilot studies that have tried to implement conservation agriculture. And there are pros and cons in the African context. There are trade-offs that have to be made. It's not always effective, and also it's not always adopted. One of the main trade-offs is this idea of using crop residues to provide permanent cover for your fields. Many African farmers actually use those crop residues for other purposes, either as animal feed in these mixed livestock and cropping systems, or actually as fuel for household cooking. So if you're going to try and convince a farmer to leave crop residues on the fields, then you're going to need to find them alternative sources of feed for their animal and fuel sources. Agronomic studies have shown that actually it's better for the whole farming system to use those crop residues for other purposes rather than for conservation agriculture. There's also been, in some instances, a reluctance of farmers to take on intercropping, particularly with legumes, so peas and beans. And that's because actually there isn't a big market for peas and beans in the African context. So you're trying to convince a farmer to plant lentils, and then he or she has nowhere to sell them. So there's really no incentive for them to take on this kind of conservation agriculture. So that really points to the fact that when you're trying to make these interventions, you have to think of the bigger picture. It's not only about what's happening on the farm, but it's around agricultural policies, infrastructure for this new type of crop, and actually, very importantly, new markets that allow the farmers to actually sell this, what's in theory a very nice mixed farming set of farming products into the market. So there's a good example from Ethiopia where both providing access to seeds and creating new markets led to a big increase in chickpea cultivation, which is a legume, alongside teff, which is the local cereal. And that then led to much more productive farms where they were getting money from the chickpea crops, but at the same time, the teff production had also increased by about 15%.